There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house once the children are grown and the phone finally stops ringing. It is not loneliness, exactly. It is something closer to a held breath, finally let go after decades. A woman sits at her kitchen table, coffee cooling untouched in front of her, and for the first time in as long as she can remember, there is nothing urgent pulling at her. No one needs her right this second. And in that stillness, something unfamiliar rises. Not peace. Not yet. Something closer to a question she has never let herself ask out loud. What did all of that cost me? She was born somewhere between 1965 and 1975, in a window of American history that rarely gets its own name. Too young to have marched, too old to have grown up with the language of therapy and self-care that later generations would inherit almost by default. She was the child of people who had fought, bled, and buried others for the right to simply exist with dignity, and she was raised to be the proof that it had all been worth it. Not the fight itself. The result of the fight. She was supposed to be the evidence that things had changed. That is a heavy thing to hand a child, even if no one ever says it directly. Nobody sits a 6-year-old down and explains that she is now responsible for justifying her parents' sacrifice. It is absorbed instead, in 1,000 small moments. In being told to sit still and be good when adults are talking. In being dressed carefully, hair pressed and parted just so, before something as ordinary as a trip to the grocery store, because appearance was armor, and armor could not be optional. In watching a mother work 2 jobs and never once complain, not because there was nothing to complain about, but because complaining was a luxury that had not yet been budgeted into the family's survival. She may have been one of the first black children in a newly desegregated classroom, sitting in a room where she was watched more closely than anyone else, expected to behave better, achieve more, and take up less space, all at once. Historians sometimes describe this period as one defined by firsts: the first black student in a class, the first black employee in a department, a status that sounds like an achievement but often functioned as a quiet, constant surveillance. Every mistake was magnified. Every success was treated as unusual rather than expected. She learned early that she was representing something larger than herself, even before she had the vocabulary to understand what that meant. This is where a phrase enters her life that will follow her for decades: be twice as good. It is said with love. It is meant as protection, a survival instruction passed down the way a parent teaches a child to look both ways before crossing a street. And it teaches her, underneath the words, that her natural self was never going to be enough on its own, that ordinary effort was a risk she could not afford to take. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called John Henryism, named for the folk hero who worked himself to death outrunning a machine. It describes a specific kind of coping, one built almost entirely out of high-effort striving against obstacles that refuse to move. People who cope this way often do remarkably well on the surface. They achieve. They provide. They endure. Researchers who study this pattern in Black Americans have found it linked to elevated blood pressure and chronic stress markers, evidence that the mind's determination to push through does not exempt the body from paying a price. But the body keeps a ledger that the mind is too busy to check, and over years, that ledger comes due in the form of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, and a fatigue that feels less physical than existential. This is not a personal failing. It is the biological cost of being handed a task too large for any one person, and completing it anyway, quietly, without complaint, because complaint was never modeled as an option. Alongside that comes something family researchers call parentification, a term for what happens when a child is given adult responsibilities before she has finished being a child. Perhaps she was the eldest daughter, watching younger siblings after school while her mother worked a second shift, learning to cook dinner from memory rather than a recipe, to settle arguments before they became something louder, to keep the household calm long before she had any framework for her own emotional needs. The kitchen radio played Motown low in the background while she stood at the stove on a chair too short for the counter, greens simmering for hours, the whole house smelling like Sunday even on a Tuesday. She became fluent in caretaking before she became fluent in anything else. And a girl who is taught early that her value lies in what she can hold for other people rarely stops to ask, later, what is holding her? Church, for many women of this generation, became the one sanctioned place where feeling was allowed to surface. Not through conversation. Through song. Through the particular release of a congregation standing together, voices rising, something unspeakable finding its way out through melody instead of words. It was not therapy, but it functioned, in its way, as one of the only outlets available. Faith gave her endurance. It gave her a framework for suffering that had meaning, and a community that showed up for funerals and hospital visits and Sunday dinners without needing to be asked twice. But faith, in the way it was often taught, also quietly reinforced the idea that pain was something to carry with grace rather than something to name and examine. Grace and honesty are not opposites, but she was rarely shown how to hold both at once. Now look at her present, decades later. She may be caring for an aging parent, sitting in waiting rooms filling out forms with a tired hand, while also fielding calls from adult children who still, in ways large and small, expect her to be the anchor. She has become the person everyone in the family calls when something goes wrong, not because she asked for the role, but because she has never once put it down. Some evenings she drives home from work in silence, the radio off, grateful simply for a stretch of road where no one needs anything from her. Other nights she sits on the porch after the dishes are done, phone finally quiet, and lets herself do nothing at all, though it still takes a conscious effort not to feel guilty about it. Watching her own children make choices she never had the freedom to make, choices about career, about rest, about naming their feelings out loud, she feels something complicated, pride tangled together with a grief she cannot quite name. She is glad they are free. She is also aware, in a place she rarely visits, that she never got to be. This is the part of her story that is easiest to misunderstand from the outside. People see her composure and assume it is simply who she has always been, an inborn steadiness rather than something constructed, plank by plank, out of necessity. They do not see the effort it takes to remain the reliable one, decade after decade, without ever being asked whether she wanted the job. Her toughness was not a personality trait. It was an assignment, handed to her early, reinforced constantly, and never once questioned, because questioning it would have meant admitting that something about her upbringing had asked too much of her. And admitting that felt, for a long time, like betrayal. But something shifts in midlife, when the schedule finally loosens and there is unstructured time for the first time in years. Psychologists sometimes call this a life review, a natural turning inward that tends to happen as people move into their 50s, a quiet reassessment of everything that came before. For a woman raised the way she was raised, this life review often arrives uninvited, in the form of a stillness she does not know what to do with. She sits with an old photo album and does not recognize the young woman staring back at her, hopeful and unguarded in a way she cannot remember feeling since. She stands in front of a mirror and notices gray hair she never had time to acknowledge, and wonders, briefly, where the years actually went, underneath all the doing. None of this is a rejection of who she became. She does not need to disown her strength to be honest about its cost. She can hold both truths without contradiction. That her endurance gave her a life, a family, a legacy she can be proud of, and that it also asked something of her that she was never fully compensated for, emotionally speaking. Resilience and grief are not opposites. They have been living in the same house the entire time, and it is only now, in this quieter chapter, that she has the space to let them finally meet. What she is being invited to consider, gently, is that toughness was a role she learned to play extraordinarily well, not the entirety of who she is. She is allowed to be strong and soft. She is allowed to have provided for everyone and still need someone to ask how she is doing. She is allowed to sit in her kitchen with cooling coffee and simply be still, without needing that stillness to be productive or explained or justified to anyone, including herself. And so she remains there, in that same quiet kitchen from the beginning, coffee still cooling, the house still silent around her. Nothing about the scene has changed, but something in how she is sitting has. Her stillness no longer reads as exhaustion waiting to be filled. It reads, for what may be the first time in her adult life, as peace she did not have to earn twice.